Okeke's arms burned as he pulled his fishing nets from the river. The weight was unusual, too light yet strangely resistant. The other fishermen had similar expressions of confusion as they hauled in their own traps. Normally, the river of Omoga provided them with abundant fish, but today something was wrong. Okeke gasped when he saw his catch. Not a single fish. Instead, entangled in his net were birds, small, soaked creatures, flapping weakly, their eyes reflecting the dim light of dawn. Around him, others had caught the same thing. Birds, drenched, gasping birds. Panic spread among the men. The river had never failed them before. Okeke dropped the net and stepped back, his breathing shallow. "This is an abomination," muttered Chukwudi, an older fisherman. Ezugo, the strongest among them, spat into the water. "This is not normal. This is not natural." In the distance, the village shrine's bell rang, a bad omen. The river had spoken, and Omoaga would not be the same again. By noon, the entire village had gathered at the riverside. Women whispered behind their wrappers. Children clung to their mothers, and the elders stood in a solemn line, their faces heavy with unspoken fears. The chief, Nwokoro, stepped forward. "How can this be? Since the time of our ancestors, the river has fed us. If the fish are gone, it means the girls are angry." Mamozo, the priestess, lifted her staff and tapped it against the earth. "This is no ordinary anger," she said. "This is punishment. Something was done, something hidden, and now the river is revealing it." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Punishment? Hidden sins? The villagers exchanged nervous glances. "Who has offended the gods?" A man called out. "Who has brought this upon us?" Silence. No one spoke, but deep in the crowd, some faces turned pale. They knew. Night fell, but the river did not rest. Ezugo sat outside his hut, staring at the moonlit water. Then he saw it, a flock of birds rising from the river's surface. Dripping wet, their feathers glowing in the dark. His heart pounded. Birds did not live in the water. They did not rise from it like spirits returning from the underworld. In the village, others saw strange things too. Adana, a young girl, swore she had whispers in the water. The widow, Neka, claimed she saw a face staring up from the depths. The once clear river had turned dark. Its depths, murky and unwelcoming. Fear tightened its grip on Omoga. The villagers gathered again at the shrine. Mamozo stood before them, her voice sharp and commanding. "The spirits are restless. A crime was committed long ago, and until the truth is spoken, this cause will not leave us." Eyes darted at the elders. The chief's face twitched. The old man shifted uncomfortably. Something had been done, something wicked. And now the river was demanding justice. Among the oldest villagers, whispers of a dark secret spread like wildfire. Nwokoro, the chief, sat alone in his hut, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He remembered the night, a night buried in silence, a scene hidden beneath the waves. It had happened 30 years ago. A poor fisherman named Obinna had been falsely accused of stealing from a rich merchant. The elders, eager to protect the merchant's reputation, declared Obinna guilty without evidence. The punishment was cruel. He was taken to the river, his hands tied with ropes and thrown in. They had watched him struggle. They had watched the water swallow him. And then they had turned away, leaving his soul to rot beneath the waves. Now the river was speaking for him. The birds they caught were a warning, spirits rising, demanding justice. Chief Mokoro buried his face in his hands. If the truth came out, the villagers' trust in its leaders would crumble. But how much longer could they keep silent? At sunrise, the villagers assembled at the shrine once more. Mamozo stood tall, her eyes fierce. The spirits have shown the truth, she declared. A soul cries for justice. Until the crime is confessed and the guilty are punished, the river will not give us fish again. The crowd gasped. Some turned to the elders, who stood rigid. Chukwode, one of the oldest men, swallowed hard. And if we do nothing, Mamuzo's voice was like thunder. Then the river would take what it is owned. Not just fish, not just birds, but lives. A shiver ran through the villagers. The curse had only begun, and now it would claim those who remained silent. The fishermen refused to return to the river. Fear gripped their hearts, and their families whispered about the spirits lurking beneath the water. But hunger would not wait. A young man named Ikenna, desperate to feed his sick mother, ignored the warnings. He took a small canoe at dusk and paddled out alone. The river was eerily still, the air thick with a strange heaviness. Casting his net, Ikenna held his breath. It sank into the dark water. Minutes passed. He tugged, expecting resistance, but the net was too light. Then something unseen snatched him from the canoe. His scream shattered the silence. The villagers rushed to the riverbank, but they saw only his overturned boat. Drifting aimlessly, the river had claimed him. Mamozo turned to the chief. This is just the beginning. The village mourned, but deeper than their sorrow was a chilling realization. The river was now taking its payment in blood. 9-year-old Obianuju had always been different. She spoke little, but she listened, especially to the wind and the water. Since the curse began, she had been hearing voices in the river. That night, she dreamt of a man with bound hands, sinking into the water, his eyes pleading for justice. When she woke, her heart pounded. She told her grandmother, but the old woman pressed a trembling finger on her lips. Speak of this to no one, child. But Obianuju could not stay silent. She ran to the shrine and grabbed Mamozo's hand. The river told me what happened, she whispered. A man was killed here long ago. Mamozo's eyes darkened. Who did you see? I don't know his name, but he is waiting for the truth. The priestess knew the spirits had chosen a messenger, and they would not wait much longer. The council of elders met in secret. Nwokoro, Chukwode, and 3 others sat in silence, the air heavy with shame. We must confess, said Chukwode. The gods will not rest. Nwokoro's face was pale. And if we do, what then? Do you think the villagers will forgive us for drowning an innocent man? The elders were all quiet. They all knew the answer. The people could demand their heads. We must find another way, Nwokoro muttered. A way to cleanse the land without exposing ourselves. But the river could not be fooled. The longer they delayed, the angrier the spirits became. At dawn, the village awoke to a terrifying sight. The wet birds they had been catching no longer just flapped helplessly. Now they spoke. In hoarse, human-like voices, they cried out one name, Obinna. Obinna, the murdered man. The villagers trembled as they watched the birds struggle in the nets, their beaks opening and closing, calling for justice. A woman fainted. A man ran screaming. The fishermen burned their nets. No one dared approach the river again. The spirits were no longer whispering, they were shouting. That night, a storm like no other shook Umoga. Rain poured in torrents, lightning flashed, and the river swelled as though preparing to swallow the entire village. Mamuzo gathered the villagers in the shrine. The gods are done waiting. By the next full moon, if the guilty do not confess, the river will drown this village. The people murmured in fear. Then a voice spoke from the back of the shrine. I know who did it. The crowd turned. It was Obianuju. I saw him in my dream, she said, staring directly at the elders. I saw what you did. The shrine fell into stunned silence. Nwokoro's hands began to shake. The shrine was deadly silent. Obianuju's small voice had shattered the air like thunder. Nwokoro was the first to speak. This child speaks nonsense. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed fear. Mamozo stepped forward. Obianuju is a child, but the spirits have chosen her as their messenger. If she lies, let the gods strike her now. The villagers gasped. The elders clenched their fists. Obianuju didn't flinch. She only turned her sharp eyes to each elder, watching them squirm under her gaze. Then she spoke again. You drowned Obinna, the river remembers. A murmur spread through the crowd. Obinna, a man who had disappeared many years ago, his name now almost forgotten. An elder spat on the ground. What proof does she have? The river is cursed, but she is only a child with wild dreams. Mamuzo's voice rose. The proof is in the water, in the birds, in the ones we have already lost. The people looked at Nwokoro and the other elders, but no one spoke. Not yet. That night, the village was divided. Some believed the child, others feared what uncovering the past would bring. But the river had already made up its mind. The next morning, a terrifying cry rang through Omoga. A fisherman had gone to the river before dawn, hoping to prove his courage. Instead, he returned screaming, Come and see! Come and see what the river has given back. The villagers rushed to the riverbank, where something floated among the reeds. A body. At first, they thought it was Ikenna, the boy who had been swallowed by the river days ago. But when they dragged the corpse to the shore, gasps erupted. It was not Ikenna, it was Obinna. His body, still bound with ropes, had resurfaced after 10 years. The elders trembled. The river had finally spoken. Panic spread through the elders, circled like wildfire. Their sin had risen from the depths. Nwokoro slammed his fist on the wooden table inside his hut. We must do something. If the villagers connect to Obinna's death, we are finished. Chukwudi's face was pale. What can we do? The spirits have already revealed the truth. Nwokoro's eyes darkened. Then we must make them doubt it. That night, the elders spread whispers through the village. They claimed Obinna had not been murdered, but had fallen into the river by accident. It is all a trick of the spirits, they said. The gods are testing our faith. Some villagers hesitated. Could this be true? Could it all be a misunderstanding? But others were not so easily deceived. Mamozo, standing before Obinna's bloated body, murmured, The river does not return the dead unless it seeks justice. The village was divided, but the river was not. The next day, another horror struck Omoga. The first elder was found dead. Nwokoro's son discovered his father at dawn, lying near the river, his eyes wide open, mouth frozen in a scream. His body was completely dry, as if the river had drained every drop of water from him. The people whispered. The spirits were no longer waiting for justice, they were taking it themselves. Chukwudi, now terrified, ran to Mamuzo's shrine. We will confess everything. Mamuzo shook her head. The gods will not accept empty words. The truth must be spoken before the whole village. Chukwudi shivered. The price of silence was death, but the price of confession was exile, or worse. That evening, a dark cloud settled over Omoga. Thunder rolled in the distance, but no rain fell. It was an omen. The people gathered at the village square, summoned by Mamuzo. Chukwudi stood among them, trembling, ready to speak. Then lightning struck the river. A sound like 1,000 screams filled the air. The water boiled, churned, and in its depths, shadowy figures moved. The spirits had come. Chukwudi fell to his knees. I confess, we killed Obinna. We tied his hands and threw him into the river. The crowd gasped. The other elders tried to flee, but the wind howled, trapping them in the square. Mamuzo raised her voice. The river has taken its payment in blood, but will the village forgive? The people murmured. The storm raged. A deep silence followed Chukwudi's confession. The villagers' eyes burned with a mix of fury, betrayal, and disbelief. How could you? A man cried, stepping forward. It was Obinna's younger brother Chijoke. His fists were clenched, his body shaking. He was one of us. He was your own blood. More voices joined. Murderers, you cursed us all. Because of you, our children have died. The elders fell to their knees, pleading for mercy, but the people had none to give. Mamuzo stepped forward. The river has spoken, but what will the people say? The crowd roared, banish them, let the gods decide their fate. Then a frail voice rose above the noise. It was Obianuju. She stood before the crowd, her small frame unshaken. Banishment is not enough, she said. The river demands more. A cold wind swept through the square, carrying her words. By dawn, the decision was made. The guilty elders were to be cast into the river. Let the spirits who had been wronged deal with them. Some villagers hesitated. Killing them this way, was it justice or vengeance? But Chijoke, the brother of the murdered Obinna, stepped forward. They tied my brother's hands and threw him into the river alive. Let them test the fate they gave him. The elders begged. Some even tried to run, but the villagers were relentless. When they reached the riverbank, the water was still, waiting. One by one, the elders were pushed in. The water swallowed them whole. Not a single ripple remained. Days passed. No birds fell from the sky. The people still feared the river, unsure if the curse had been lifted. Then, one morning, the fisherman cast his net into the water. For the first time in years, he pulled out a fish. Tears filled his eyes. He ran to the village, holding the fish above his head. The river has forgiven us. Joy erupted. Drums sounded. The people danced, celebrating the end of their suffering. But Mamuzo, standing at the edge of the water, whispered, "The river never forgets." Though the village was rejoicing, Obianuju had one last dream. She woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. In her vision, the river had spoken to her. Something still remained unresolved. She ran to Mamuzo. "There is one more sin hidden." Mamuzo's face grew serious. "Then we must find it before the river does." They gathered the remaining elders, the ones who had not been part of Obinna's murder, but had known the truth and stayed silent. "We thought keeping quiet would protect the village," one admitted. Mamuzo's voice was heard. "Silence can be just as deadly as the crime itself." And with that, the last of the guilty were exiled. Only then did the river send its final blessing, a great flood, washing away the old shrine, carrying the last remnant of the curses into the sea. Years later, Obianuju stood by the river, now a grown woman. The village had healed, the curse had lifted, and the fishermen no longer feared what they would pull from the depths. Yet, she still heard whispers of the river. The truth always rises. She had saved her people, but at a cost. Many had died and others had suffered. Justice had been served, but the wounds remained. Mamozo, now old and frail, placed a hand on her shoulder. The river speaks to those who listen. You were chosen, child. Obianuju turned to her. And what if another secret is buried someday? Mamozo smiled, looking at the flowing water. Then the river will rise again. And as the wind carried their voices away, Obianuju knew the river never forgets. From this story, we learn that evil deeds will always come to light, no matter how deeply they are buried.